Richard Holloway was a name everyone in the city knew. He wasn't just rich, he was extraordinarily rich. From owning multiple businesses to driving luxury cars and living in a mansion that looked more like a palace, Richard seemed to have it all. People admired him not only for his wealth, but also for how he had built his empire from scratch. Starting as a small-time entrepreneur, he worked tirelessly, took risks, and eventually turned his dreams into reality. But despite all his success, there was one thing that made Richard truly happy: his family. Margaret, his wife of over 20 years, was his rock. She had been by his side since they were teenagers, supporting him through thick and thin. They weren't always wealthy. In fact, when they first got married, they struggled to make ends meet, but Margaret never complained. Instead, she encouraged Richard to chase his ambitions while keeping their home warm and welcoming. Together, they raised two wonderful children, a son named Ethan and a daughter named Lily, who were now teenagers full of energy and potential. On the surface, life was perfect. Richard's days were filled with board meetings, networking events, and making big decisions that shaped his company's future. At night, he returned to his beautiful mansion, where Margaret greeted him with a smile, and the kids shared stories about school or sports practice. It was the kind of life most people could only dream of. But deep down, Richard felt restless. As the years went by, the thrill of building his empire began to fade. The same routines that once excited him now felt monotonous. Dinner conversations with Margaret no longer sparked joy. Instead, they reminded him of how predictable everything had become. Even spending time with Ethan and Lily didn't bring the same satisfaction it used to. Something was missing, though Richard couldn't quite put his finger on what. Then came the gala, a charity event Richard attended every year. This particular evening would change his life forever. Among the crowd of well-dressed guests, he noticed someone new: Sophia. She was young, vibrant, and breathtakingly beautiful. Unlike anyone else at the event, Sophia radiated confidence and creativity. A talented artist, she was showcasing her paintings, which caught Richard's eye immediately. Her artwork was bold, colorful, and alive. Everything Richard secretly wished his own life still was. Curious, Richard struck up a conversation with her. To his surprise, Sophia wasn't intimidated by his status or wealth. She spoke freely, sharing her passion for art and travel. For the first time in years, Richard felt genuinely intrigued by someone outside his usual circle. Over the next few weeks, their paths crossed repeatedly. At social events, coffee shops, and even art galleries, each encounter left Richard craving more. Sophia represented everything his current life lacked: spontaneity, excitement, and freedom. As their friendship grew stronger, so did Richard's dissatisfaction with his marriage. Margaret tried her best to reconnect with him, sensing that something was off, but Richard pushed her away. He convinced himself that staying with Margaret meant settling for mediocrity. And Sophia, she offered him a chance to start fresh, to live the adventurous, exhilarating life he believed he deserved. Little did Richard know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would unravel his carefully constructed world. But at that moment, blinded by infatuation and longing for something new, Richard saw no other option. His heart and ego had already decided. The decision to leave Margaret didn't come overnight, but once Richard made up his mind, there was no turning back. He spent weeks planning how to break the news, rehearsing what he would say in his head. In his mind, he framed it as a necessary step, a way to reclaim his happiness and live authentically. But deep down, even Richard couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt that crept in whenever he looked at Margaret or heard her cheerful voice calling out to him from another room. One chilly evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Richard finally sat Margaret down in their living room. The atmosphere felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the air itself knew something terrible was about to happen. Margaret, sensing his unease, asked softly, "What's wrong, Richard?" "You've been distant lately." Her tone was calm, concerned, everything a loving wife should be. But instead of soothing him, it only made Richard feel worse. "I need to talk to you," he began hesitantly, avoiding her gaze. "This isn't easy for me, but I think we should separate." For a moment, silence hung between them like a thick fog. Margaret stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Separate?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Why? Did I do something wrong?" Richard shook his head quickly, though his hesitation betrayed him. "It's not you, Margaret. It's me. I'm unhappy. This life, it's not what I want anymore." Margaret's face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. "After everything we've been through together, after all these years, how can you just throw it away?" Her words cut deeper than Richard expected, but he pushed forward, desperate to justify his actions. "I've changed, Margaret. We've grown apart. I need something different." Though he didn't say her name aloud, Margaret instinctively understood. "Is this about Sophia?" she asked, her voice breaking. "That woman you've been seeing?" Richard froze, caught off guard by her directness. He hadn't realized Margaret knew about Sophia, or maybe she had suspected all along. Either way, the truth was out now, and there was no denying it. "Yes," he admitted quietly, shame washing over him. "She makes me feel alive again. With her, I'm not stuck in this endless cycle of routine and responsibility." Margaret let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "So that's it. You're leaving me for someone younger, someone who doesn't know you like I do." "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I have to think about myself too." The argument that followed was one of the hardest moments of both their lives. Margaret pleaded, begged, and even accused him of being selfish, but nothing could change Richard's mind. By the end of the night, they were strangers sitting across from each other, bound only by years of memories that now seemed tainted. When Richard moved out a few weeks later, the impact rippled through their entire family. Ethan and Lily struggled to understand why their father was leaving, while Margaret tried her best to shield them from the pain. Friends and acquaintances whispered behind closed doors, some sympathizing with Margaret, others criticizing Richard for throwing away a good thing. Meanwhile, Richard started a new chapter with Sophia. At first, everything felt exhilarating. They traveled the world, attended glamorous parties, and lived a life free from the responsibilities Richard had left behind. But as time went on, cracks began to form. Sophia wasn't the carefree artist Richard had fallen for. She had expectations, demands, and insecurities of her own. And without Margaret to ground him, Richard found himself increasingly isolated, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. But it was too late to turn back now. Life with Sophia started off like a whirlwind romance straight out of a movie. For the first few months, Richard couldn't believe his luck. Gone were the quiet dinners at home and predictable routines he had grown tired of. Instead, every day felt like an adventure. Sophia introduced him to a world of art galleries, exotic travel destinations, and late-night parties filled with laughter and music. She dressed impeccably, spoke passionately about her dreams, and seemed to light up any room she entered. At her side, Richard felt younger, more alive, like he was finally living the life he deserved. But as the initial excitement wore off, reality began to creep in. Sophia wasn't just beautiful and charming. She was also complex, with emotions that shifted like the tides. One moment, she'd be gushing over Richard, telling him how much she admired his ambition and success. The next, she'd snap at him over something trivial, a missed phone call, a forgotten anniversary, or even the way he ordered dinner at a restaurant. These mood swings left Richard confused and walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of Sophia he'd encounter each day. At first, Richard brushed it off, chalking it up to artistic temperament. After all, Sophia was different from Margaret, more spontaneous, less conventional. He told himself that adjusting to this new dynamic was part of the package deal. But as time went on, The cracks in their relationship grew harder to ignore. Sophia became increasingly demanding, wanting Richard to prioritize her above everything else. She resented his long hours at work, accusing him of being married to his business instead of her. Arguments became frequent, often escalating into shouting matches that left both of them drained. What bothered Richard most was how lonely he felt, despite having Sophia by his side. In the past, when things got tough, he could always turn to Margaret for support. She understood him, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and stood by him no matter what. With Sophia, however, there was no such comfort. Their connection felt superficial, built more on fleeting passion than genuine understanding. The deeper they went into their relationship, the more Richard realized how little they truly knew about each other. To make matters worse, guilt continued to haunt him. Every time he thought about Margaret and their children, a pang of regret shot through his chest. He tried to push those thoughts aside, convincing himself that he had done the right thing, that leaving his old life behind was necessary for his happiness. Yet the image of Margaret's tear-streaked face the night he broke the news lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. Ethan and Lily, too, were distant shadows in his life now. Since the divorce, Richard saw them only during scheduled visits, and even then, their interactions felt strained. They were polite but guarded, clearly still hurt by his decision to leave. Richard missed the easy camaraderie they once shared. The jokes, the family game nights, the simple joy of watching them grow up. Now, whenever he looked at them, he saw disappointment staring back. As months turned into years, Richard found himself questioning whether he had made a mistake. Was this glamorous, unpredictable life with Sophia really better than the stable, loving home he had abandoned? Late at night, lying awake beside Sophia, he replayed memories of his life with Margaret. He remembered how she used to laugh at his terrible jokes, how she stayed up waiting for him after long business trips, and how she always believed in him, even when he doubted himself. Yet, pride kept him from reaching out. Admitting he was wrong and facing the consequences of his choices, not just to Margaret and his children, but to himself. So Richard buried his doubts deep inside, pretending everything was fine. On the surface, he appeared successful, enviable even. But beneath the polished exterior, he was a man adrift, searching for meaning in a life that felt emptier with each passing day. Years had passed since Richard left his old life behind, and though he tried to convince himself that he was happy, there was always a lingering emptiness inside him. He threw himself into work, traveled with Sophia, and attended social events, but nothing seemed to fill the void. It was as if a part of him was missing, something he couldn't quite name or replace. Then, one ordinary afternoon, fate intervened in a way Richard could never have anticipated. It happened at an art exhibition, a small local event showcasing emerging artists. Richard hadn't planned to attend. Sophia had dragged him along, claiming it would be good for networking. The gallery was modest compared to the high-end shows Richard usually frequented, but there was a certain charm to its simplicity. Paintings lined the walls, sculptures stood proudly on pedestals, and soft jazz played in the background. People milled about, chatting and sipping wine, while Richard wandered aimlessly, feeling out of place. That's when he saw them. Standing near a vibrant abstract painting were four young adults who looked remarkably alike. They laughed together, their movements synchronized as if they shared an unspoken connection. But what stopped Richard in his tracks wasn't just their resemblance to one another. It was how much they looked like him. The resemblance was uncanny. Each of them had his sharp jawline, his piercing blue eyes, and even his confident posture. At first, Richard thought it was a trick of the light or some strange coincidence, but the longer he stared, the more certain he became. These weren't strangers. They were connected to him in a way that defied explanation. Summoning his courage, Richard approached them cautiously. "Excuse me," he said, trying to sound casual despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I couldn't help noticing. You all look incredibly familiar." The group turned to face him, their expressions curious but guarded. One of them, a young man with short, neatly styled hair, spoke up. Familiar? How so? Well, Richard hesitated, unsure how to phrase his observation without sounding intrusive. You remind me of someone I know, or maybe myself. His words hung in the air for a moment before the group exchanged glances, clearly amused. Another member of the quartet, a woman with long, wavy hair, smiled politely. That's funny, because people often tell us we look alike. We're quadruplets, actually. Quadruplets, Richard echoed, his heart racing. That's incredible. Yes, it is, chimed in another sibling, a tall man with a warm smile. We're Alex, Ben, Clara, and Daisy, he added, gesturing to each of them in turn. And you are? I'm Richard, he replied quickly, shaking hands with each of them. This might sound strange, but do you happen to know your father? The question caught them off guard. For a brief moment, silence fell over the group. Then Clara, the one with wavy hair, spoke up. Our mom raised us on her own. She told us our father left before we were born. Why do you ask? Richard's throat tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories from years ago. A waitress named Evelyn, a drunken night, a fleeting encounter he had dismissed as meaningless. Could it be possible? Could these four extraordinary individuals be his children? I think I may know something about that, Richard stammered finally. But perhaps we should sit down somewhere private to talk. This is important. The quadruplets exchanged skeptical looks, clearly unsure whether to trust this stranger who claimed to have answers about their past. But something in Richard's tone, a mix of urgency and vulnerability, convinced them to hear him out. Together, they moved to a quiet corner of the gallery, where Richard began sharing pieces of his story, hoping against hope that he wasn't too late to make things right. Building a relationship with the quadruplets wasn't easy, and Richard knew it wouldn't happen overnight. He had spent years absent from their lives, and trust, once broken, wasn't something that could be repaired with a few heartfelt conversations or expensive gifts. But Richard was determined to prove himself, not as a distant benefactor, but as a real father who cared deeply about their happiness and well-being. He started small, taking genuine interest in their individual passions. Alex, the ambitious entrepreneur, was working on launching a tech startup aimed at simplifying online payments for small businesses. When Richard heard about it, he didn't just offer financial support. He rolled up his sleeves and helped Alex refine his business plan, sharing insights from his own journey as a self-made millionaire. For the first time, Alex saw Richard not as an estranged figure from his past, but as someone who genuinely wanted to see him succeed. Ben, the musician, was preparing for his first major tour across the country. Richard attended one of his performances, a small gig at a local club, and was blown away by his talent. Afterward, he approached Ben with an idea. Why not sponsor his tour and help him reach a wider audience? At first, Ben hesitated, wary of accepting help from someone he barely knew. But Richard assured him it wasn't charity, it was an investment in his dream. You're incredibly talented, Ben, Richard said earnestly. The world needs to hear your music. Clara, the passionate environmental activist, was fighting to protect a local forest from being cleared for commercial development. She expected Richard to dismiss her cause as impractical or idealistic, given his background in business. Instead, he surprised her by showing up at one of her protests, standing alongside her as she spoke passionately to the crowd. Later, he used his influence to connect her with lawyers and lobbyists who could amplify her efforts. Clara began to see Richard not as the corporate tycoon she'd imagined, but as someone willing to fight for what mattered most to her. Daisy, the writer, was quieter than her siblings but equally driven. Her debut novel, a poignant story about family and forgiveness, had been rejected by multiple publishers. Richard read the manuscript late one night and found himself moved to tears. The next day, He arranged a meeting with a renowned publishing house, ensuring Daisy's work got the attention it deserved. When the book was finally published, Daisy dedicated it to the unexpected moments that change everything. Though she didn't name him directly, Richard knew she meant him. Through these gestures, Richard slowly earned their respect, and eventually, their affection. They began inviting him to family dinners, birthdays, and other milestones. Each interaction brought them closer, filling the gaps left by years of separation. Richard learned to laugh at Ben's jokes, admire Clara's determination, marvel at Alex's vision, and appreciate Daisy's quiet wisdom. In return, they taught him lessons he hadn't realized he needed: humility, patience, and the importance of truly listening. But reconnecting with the quadruplets also forced Richard to confront the pain he'd caused Evelyn. During one candid conversation, she admitted how hard it had been to raise 4 children alone while battling judgment from others. "I didn't need your money, Richard," she said firmly. "I needed you to show up, to care." Her words stayed with him, fueling his resolve to be present, not just financially but emotionally. He made a conscious effort to attend school events, celebrate their achievements, and simply spend time with them without distractions. Slowly, the awkwardness between them faded, replaced by warmth and mutual understanding. As Richard grew closer to his newfound family, he couldn't help but reflect on the life he'd left behind. Memories of Margaret and their children surfaced often, reminding him of the bridges he'd burned. One evening, after a particularly meaningful dinner with the quadruplets, Richard picked up the phone and dialed Margaret's number. It was time to face the past, not to erase it, but to seek closure and perhaps redemption. Years had passed since Richard's life took its unexpected turn, and though the scars of his past decisions remained, they no longer defined him. Tonight, as he stood in the grand dining hall of his mansion, surrounded by laughter and chatter, Richard couldn't help but marvel at how far he'd come. The room was alive with warmth. Family, friends, and loved ones gathered together for a celebration that felt more like a reunion than a party. On one side of the table sat Margaret, her smile softer now, less guarded. Beside her were Ethan and Lily, who had grown into remarkable adults. Ethan, now a successful architect, proudly showed off pictures of his latest project, while Lily, a teacher, shared stories about her students with sparkling enthusiasm. Though their relationship with Richard would never fully erase the pain of his absence, they had found a way to move forward, to rebuild what was broken and create something new. Across from them were Evelyn and the quadruplets, each shining brightly in their own unique way. Alex's startup had taken off, earning accolades and changing lives. Ben's music career soared, with sold-out shows across the country. Clara's environmental campaign saved not just the forests she fought for, but inspired others to join her cause. And Daisy's novel became a bestseller, touching hearts worldwide with its message of resilience and redemption. Seeing them thrive filled Richard with pride, not because of what they achieved, but because of who they were: compassionate, driven, and unapologetically themselves. As dinner wound down, Richard rose to speak, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "I won't keep you long," he began, glancing around the room. "But tonight feels special, not because of where we are, but because of who we're here with. A few years ago, I thought my life was over. I'd made mistakes I didn't think I could fix, hurt people I cared about deeply, and lost sight of what truly mattered." He paused, looking at Margaret, then at Evelyn, before turning to his children. "But life has a funny way of giving us second chances if we're willing to take them. Each of you has taught me lessons I'll carry for the rest of my days, about forgiveness, perseverance, and the power of unconditional love. You've shown me that success isn't measured by wealth or titles, but by the connections we nurture and the impact we leave behind." His gaze lingered on the quadruplets, who smiled back at him with quiet gratitude. "To my incredible kids, you've reminded me what it means to be a father. Not just providing for someone, but being present, listening, and believing in them, even when they doubt themselves. Thank you for letting me be part of your journey." Finally, he turned to Margaret. And to Margaret, I can never undo the pain I caused, but I hope you know how sorry I am. You raised two amazing children, and I'll forever admire your strength and grace. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that family isn't just blood. It's the people who stand by you, challenge you, and remind you of your worth. That's what all of you have done for me. The room erupted in applause, but Richard barely noticed. His eyes welled with tears as he looked around at the faces of those he loved most. For so many years, he chased happiness in all the wrong places, in wealth, status, and fleeting romances. But now, standing amidst this patchwork family, he finally understood what true fulfillment felt like. Later that evening, as guests began to leave, Richard stepped outside onto the balcony. The cool night air brushed against his face, carrying with it a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. Below, he saw Evelyn hugging Clara goodbye, Margaret laughing with Ethan and Lily, and the quadruplets animatedly discussing plans for their next big adventure. In that moment, Richard realized something profound. He wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was creating a legacy, a tapestry woven with threads of love, forgiveness, and second chances. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was real. And for the first time in years, Richard felt truly, deeply happy. Life had given him another shot, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. When Richard finally mustered the courage to call Margaret, his hands trembled as he dialed her number. Years had passed since their divorce, and though they occasionally exchanged polite messages about Ethan and Lily, their conversations were always brief and formal. Reaching out now felt like stepping into uncharted territory, a fragile bridge he wasn't sure could hold his weight. To his surprise, Margaret answered on the second ring. Her voice was calm but guarded. "Richard, is everything okay?" I need to talk to you," Richard said, his words tumbling out awkwardly. "Can we meet somewhere? Just for coffee or something?" There was a pause, long enough to make Richard wonder if she'd hang up. Then softly, she replied, "All right. Tomorrow afternoon at the cafe near the park." Relief washed over him. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll see you then." The next day, Richard arrived early, pacing nervously outside the cafe. When Margaret appeared, she looked much the same, her kind eyes still warm, though there was a distance in them that hadn't been there before. They sat down across from each other, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unsaid words and years of hurt. Finally, Richard broke it. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. A real one. What I did to you, to our family, it was wrong. Selfish, and I've regretted it every single day since." Margaret studied him carefully, her expression unreadable. "Why now, Richard? After all this time?" "Because I've been forced to confront who I am and what I've done," he admitted. "Meeting my other children, the quadruplets, it made me realize how much damage I caused by walking away. Not just to you and Ethan and Lily, but to myself too. I thought leaving would bring me happiness, but instead, it left me emptier than ever." Margaret sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "Do you know how hard it was for us? For me to explain to the kids why their father chose someone else over them. To rebuild our lives without you while trying to shield them from the pain." "I can only imagine," Richard said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I hate myself for putting you through that. You didn't deserve any of it, Margaret. None of you did." For a moment, she simply stared at him, her eyes brimming with tears. Then, unexpectedly, she reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "I won't lie and say I forgive you completely. Healing takes time, Richard. But I will say this. Seeing you acknowledge your mistakes, it means something. It's a start." Those words meant more to Richard than she could have known. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, not for reconciliation, but for closure. Over the next hour, they talked openly about the past, sharing stories of struggle and growth. Margaret spoke about the challenges of raising Ethan and Lily alone, while Richard confessed his regrets about missing so many milestones. Though painful, the conversation brought a sense of understanding. They weren't the same people they had been when they parted ways. In the weeks that followed, Richard began rebuilding his relationship with Ethan and Lily. He started attending their events again, Lily's college graduation, Ethan's basketball games, and making an effort to be present in their lives. At first, they were hesitant, unsure whether to trust him after years of distance. But Richard persisted, showing up consistently and proving through actions rather than words that he was committed to being there. Meanwhile, his bond with the Quadruplets continued to flourish. Together, they formed a patchwork family unlike any other, flawed, complicated, but undeniably connected. Through them, Richard rediscovered what truly mattered: love, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. As he stood one evening watching Alex pitch his startup idea to potential investors, Ben perform on stage, Clara rally supporters for her cause, and Daisy sign copies of her newly published book, Richard realized something profound. His wealth and success had once defined him, but now it was these relationships, the ones he had nearly lost forever, that gave his life meaning. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, Richard felt whole. Richard's confession left the Quadruplets stunned. Sitting in that quiet corner of the gallery, they listened intently as he recounted fragments of his past, his brief encounter with their mother, Evelyn, years ago, and how he had no idea she was pregnant. He admitted to being reckless and selfish back then, brushing off what he thought was a fleeting moment without considering the consequences. As he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion, revealing a man burdened by regret. Alex, the most outspoken of the siblings, broke the silence first. "You're saying you might be our father, just like that?" "I'm not sure yet," Richard replied honestly. "But the resemblance is undeniable. And, well, I owe it to all of you to find out the truth." Clara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Why now? Why come forward after all these years? It was a fair question, one Richard had asked himself countless times since meeting them. "Because I didn't know," he said simply. "Your mother tried to reach me, but my assistant at the time intercepted her messages. I swear, if I'd known about you I would have done things differently." Daisy, the quietest sibling, finally spoke up. "So, what happens next? Are we supposed to just trust you because you say so?" "No," Richard said firmly. "I don't expect you to trust me. Not yet. But I want answers too. If I am your father, I need to make things right. For all of us." The group agreed to take the first step: a DNA test. Over the next few days, Richard arranged everything, his mind racing with possibilities. What if they really were his children? How could he possibly make up for decades of absence? And what about Evelyn? Would she even want to see him after all these years? When the results came back positive, confirming Richard's fears and hopes, he felt a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt weighed heavily on him, but there was also a strange sense of relief. Finally, he had clarity. He reached out to Evelyn immediately, arranging a meeting at a small cafe downtown. Evelyn arrived looking hesitant, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. When she saw Richard, her expression hardened. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly, cutting straight to the point. "I wanted to explain," Richard began, his voice trembling slightly. "I never knew about the Quadruplets. You tried to contact me, didn't you?" Evelyn nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Of course I did. Do you have any idea what it was like raising 4 babies on my own? I worked 2 jobs, barely slept, and sacrificed everything to give them a decent life. And where were you? Off living your perfect little rich guy lifestyle." Her words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He deserved every ounce of her anger. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his head bowed. "If I'd known, I would have been there. I swear to you, Evelyn, I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her anger slowly giving way to exhaustion. They're good kids, Richard. Smart, talented, and resilient. Don't mess this up. With Evelyn's blessing, Richard turned his attention to building a relationship with the quadruplets. At first, they kept him at arm's length, testing his intentions. Alex challenged him during conversations, demanding honesty about his past mistakes. Ben, the musician, expressed skepticism through sarcastic remarks. Clara grilled him about his wealth and whether he saw them as charity cases. Even gentle Daisy remained cautious, observing him quietly from the sidelines. But Richard didn't give up. He listened to their stories, learned about their passions, and supported their dreams. Slowly, trust began to form. Through heartfelt conversations and shared experiences, Richard discovered who they truly were. Alex, ambitious and driven. Ben, creative and free-spirited. Clara, fiercely independent and compassionate. And Daisy, introspective and wise beyond her years. As Richard spent more time with them, he realized they weren't just reflections of himself. They were individuals shaped by their struggles and triumphs. And for the first time in years, Richard felt a spark of purpose. These four remarkable people weren't just his children. They were his second chance.